You've probably had a cable that from one day to another simply stopped working properly. It'd cut out, you'd jiggle it about a bit, and then it'd work again for a while. This type of fault is pretty common, and it's not due to you handling your cable poorly. Well, it's not always due to you handling your cable poorly. The type of fault described here occurs when a soldering joint has come loose. Sometimes it still touches the proper lug, thus it works. Other times it doesn't, and so it cuts out. And this joint can come undone even if there's no excessive force used to break it. Because many instances of small force can work just as well. The material will experience fatigue over time if there are enough cases of the soldering joint being strained a tiny bit. It's actually at a pretty high risk of being damaged. A bridge built for cars doesn't break when one car goes over it. However, after a number of years it will still need maintenance. Hundreds of thousands of cars going over it over the years will wear it down. And so does an accumulation of tiny bits of strain on a soldering joint. And now this is where I start complaining about things. As I said earlier, it's very often not because the cable was handled badly. Most of the time, these cables break because the connector's design is simply not robust enough. The most common type of strain relief in a 1/4-inch jack is just not very good. It works by virtue of bending the ends of this metal strip so that it holds on tightly to the cable's shell. Thus, any movement of the cable will in theory be transferred to the connector before it reaches the soldering joints. But this bit can be bent easily, by design. That means even if you properly tighten this strain relief into the cable's shell, it will still allow for movement. It may prevent damage from straight pulls, but that's only one of 3 dimensions. In the other 2, it can still somewhat freely move about. Every tiny movement of the cable will still by some extent be straining the soldering joint too. You can do everything right and still break your cable over time. At this point you can easily resolder it and it'll work again. But it will also break again. A way to combat this would be to completely encase everything in hot glue. But that comes with its own set of issues. One of them being that it's going to be a pain to remove the glue should you ever want or need to. The only connectors that I know that don't come with this inherent design flaw are Neutrik ones. Their strain relief is completely redesigned from the ground up, and I've never had one of these fail on me so far. Not only does it seem to work better, it's even easier to put together because it automatically engages when you close the connector. When you screw the rear of the connector on, it will squeeze these 3 prongs into the cable's insulation, and everything will be held together by pure pressure and friction. And when you open it, you don't have to try and unbend the strain relief, making reusing these connectors a breeze as well. Plus, there's a variant called the silent plug, which mutes itself as soon as you pull it. And yes, these connectors are pretty pricey. But to me it's worth the extra cost to prevent the hassle of ever having to resolder the cable. And I'd rather have the more reliable option for any live playing. And for everybody in the studio, a broken cable is going to cost you more money than you saved buying the cheaper one. If you're making your own cables, the price difference between a cable with these cheaper connectors versus the Neutrik ones suddenly gets reasonably small. The cheapest 1/4-inch jacks I found at Thomann at the time of recording this are 66 cents. The Neutrik equivalent is €2.80, so the price difference for a complete cable would end up at €4.28. And if you value your time, it's going to be worth it. Because there's another advantage that you get with these higher quality connectors. Their housing doesn't open up by itself all the freaking time. These cheap connectors are 2 metal pieces screwed together. But metal on metal has very little friction. so there's nothing stopping the hull from moving about as it pleases. Anytime you move the cable, you shake it around a bit, loosening the hull. These connectors, on the other hand, use a pretty durable plastic bit to screw into the hull. This has a lot more friction to begin with, but also due to the way the strain relief works, it actually pushes against the end bit. And it's also got these tiny bumps that would stop it from ever opening up unless you actively try to unscrew it. As a last bonus, Neutrik connectors offer different ways to color code your cables. Granted, you can do that with a bit of colored tape, but that wears out more easily and is much less visually appealing. So for any cable that I'll build from now on, I'll be using these higher quality connectors. They're easier to work with and they seem to just not ever break. I even started being slightly more rough with these cables because I don't have to care. I can just pull by the cable because the strain relief works properly. It's not a 100-year-old design that happens to sort of work. Somebody just decided to try something new, and it's better in every way, except maybe the price. There are only two reasons I can think of not to use Neutrik plugs. One, if you have basically zero space on a pedal board, there are much smaller connectors out there, like these EBS flat patch cables. The other reason being, if your cable is too fat to fit. The Neutrik NP2XL is a weird specimen. It's designed with real thick cables in mind, but not with equally thick wires. You can fit the cable in, but the solder points are the same size as in the normal design. If you use large diameter speaker wire, this will quickly become an issue because it becomes tricky to solder up without creating a short circuit.